Hello and welcome back. I'm your friend from the private Audiobooks channel. Today's video topic is Strategic Planning for Personal Success. Chapter 1: Why Most People Live Without Strategy. Being busy is not the same as moving forward. This distinction, simple as it sounds, eludes most of us for most of our lives. We wake up, respond to notifications, handle what feels urgent, attend meetings that could have been emails, reply to messages that demand nothing of substance, and collapse into bed feeling simultaneously exhausted and unaccomplished. The next day, we repeat the cycle. Weeks blur into months. Months into years. And one day we look up and realize we've been running on a treadmill set by forces we never consciously chose to obey. This is not laziness. It is not lack of effort. In fact, the people caught in this pattern are often the hardest workers in the room. They pride themselves on responsiveness, on being the one who always shows up, on never dropping the ball. But effort without direction is just motion. And motion, however vigorous, is not progress. The modern world is designed to keep you reactive. Every device you own is engineered to interrupt you. Every platform you use is optimized to capture your attention and redirect it towards someone else's priorities. The structure of most workplaces rewards firefighting over foresight. The person who handles today's crisis gets recognized. The person who prevented tomorrow's crisis remains invisible. This creates a culture where we celebrate busyness and confuse activity with achievement. Consider how you spent the last 72 hours. If you were to map out your actions, how many of them were genuinely chosen by you versus triggered by external demands? How many moved you towards something that matters to you in the long run versus simply kept you afloat in the short term? For most people, the ratio is troubling. We are living lives of perpetual reaction, and we mistake this state for normalcy. Reactive living operates on a simple but destructive logic. It prioritizes the immediate over the important. It responds to what is loud rather than what is significant. It measures a day's value by how many tasks were checked off, not by whether those tasks contributed to anything meaningful. This is not a sustainable way to build a life. It is barely a way to maintain one. The cost of living this way is not immediately visible, which is precisely why it persists. You do not wake up one morning and suddenly realize you have wasted a decade. The erosion happens slowly, imperceptibly, like water wearing down stone. You feel it as a vague sense of dissatisfaction, a nagging feeling that despite all your effort, you are not actually getting anywhere. You tell yourself you are just tired, that things will settle down soon, that once you get through this busy period you will finally have time to think about what you really want. But the busy period never ends. There is always another urgent thing waiting. This is where strategy enters the conversation, though not in the way most people understand it. Strategy is not about setting aggressive goals or creating elaborate plans filled with milestones and metrics. It is not about hustle culture or productivity hacks. Strategy, at its core, is about clarity. It is about understanding what actually matters to you and organizing your life in a way that honors that understanding. It is the antidote to reactivity. Most people do not live strategically because they have never been taught to think strategically. We are taught to work hard, to be responsible, to meet expectations, to follow the path laid out before us. But we are rarely taught to step back and ask whether the path itself is worth following. We are trained to optimize our performance within existing systems, not to question whether those systems serve us. The absence of strategy manifests in predictable ways. You feel perpetually behind, as though you are always catching up but never quite arriving. You experience a disconnect between how hard you work and how much progress you feel you are making. You struggle to say no, even to things you do not want to do, because you lack a clear framework for evaluating what deserves your time. You find yourself doing things out of obligation or habit rather than intention. You sense that your life is being shaped by forces outside your control, and you are not entirely wrong. The irony is that living without strategy often feels safer than living with one. Strategy requires you to make choices, and choices involve trade-offs. If you commit to something, you are implicitly choosing not to commit to something else. This can feel limiting, even frightening. A reactive life, by contrast, requires no such decisions. You simply respond to whatever comes your way. You stay flexible, adaptable, open to all possibilities. But this openness comes at a cost. When everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. When you are willing to do anything, you end up doing nothing that truly matters. Consider the person who wants to write a book but never starts because they are too busy with their job. The job provides a convenient excuse. It feels legitimate. After all, they have bills to pay, responsibilities to meet. But years pass, and the book remains unwritten. The job, which was supposed to be temporary, becomes permanent. The dream, which once felt urgent, fades into background noise. This is not because the person lacks talent or discipline. It is because they lack a strategic framework that would allow them to carve out space for what matters to them within the constraints of their daily life. The same pattern plays out in relationships, health, personal development, and every other domain that requires sustained attention over time. We know what we should be doing. We know exercise is important, that relationships need nurturing, that learning new skills requires consistent effort. But knowing is not enough. In the absence of strategy, knowing remains inert. It does not translate into action because there is no structure to support that translation. Living without strategy also means living without a sense of control over your own trajectory. When you are purely reactive, you are at the mercy of whatever the world throws at you. Some days are good, some are bad, but you are not steering. You are drifting. And while drifting can occasionally take you somewhere interesting, it is not a reliable way to end up where you want to be. This lack of control has psychological consequences that extend far beyond mere productivity. It affects your sense of agency, your confidence, your ability to envision a future that differs from your present. When you do not believe you have the power to shape your circumstances, you stop trying. You become passive. You accept whatever comes. And this acceptance, while sometimes framed as wisdom or maturity, is often just resignation dressed up in respectable language. The tragedy is that this entire dynamic is invisible to the person living it. From the inside, reactive living feels like the only option. It feels like you are doing your best, working as hard as you can, handling everything that comes your way. And in a sense, you are. But you are doing all of this within a framework you never chose, in service of priorities you never examined, toward outcomes you never defined. Breaking free from this pattern does not require superhuman willpower or radical life changes. It requires something simpler but more profound. The willingness to stop and think. To create space for reflection in a life that feels too full for it. To ask questions that feel obvious but are rarely answered. What do I actually want? What matters to me? What kind of life am I trying to build? These questions do not have easy answers, and they do not have permanent ones. But asking them is the beginning of strategy. Strategy is not a rigid plan imposed on your life. It is a way of thinking that allows you to navigate complexity with intention rather than simply react to it. It is the practice of choosing where to focus your limited time and energy based on what you have decided matters. It is the discipline of saying no to good opportunities so you can say yes to great ones. It is the art of building a life that reflects your values rather than someone else's expectations. The person who lives strategically does not necessarily work less than the person who lives reactively. They may even work harder. But their effort is directed. It compounds over time rather than dissipating into scattered activity. They make progress not because they are more talented or more disciplined, but because they are more intentional. They have taken the time to figure out what they are trying to accomplish and why it matters to them. And that clarity changes everything. This does not mean they never respond to urgent demands or handle unexpected crises. Life is inherently unpredictable, and flexibility matters. But their flexibility exists within a framework. They know what they are being flexible about and what they are not willing to compromise on. They have boundaries, priorities, a sense of direction. These things do not eliminate chaos, but they provide a way to navigate it without losing yourself in the process. The shift from reactive living to strategic living is not about becoming more productive in the conventional sense. It is not about squeezing more tasks into your day or optimizing your schedule down to the minute. It is about fundamentally changing your relationship with time, choice, and meaning. It is about moving from a life where things happen to you to a life where you make things happen. Not through force or hustle, but through clarity and intention. Most people resist this shift because it requires confronting uncomfortable truths. It requires admitting that some of the ways you have been spending your time do not actually serve you. It requires acknowledging that you have more control over your circumstances than you have been willing to exercise. It requires taking responsibility for your choices, including the choice to drift, which is itself a choice even though it does not feel like one. But the alternative is to continue as you have been. To remain busy without being productive, active without progressing, involved in many things but committed to nothing. To reach the end of your life and realize that you spent most of it responding to other people's priorities, living by default rather than by design. The good news is that changing this does not require burning your life down and starting over. It does not require quitting your job, abandoning your responsibilities, or making grand dramatic gestures. It requires something far more accessible and far more powerful, a shift in how you think. A commitment to becoming more deliberate about where you direct your attention and energy. A willingness to trade the comfort of reactivity for the clarity of intention. This is not motivational rhetoric. It is not a call to hustle harder or dream bigger. It is an invitation to think more clearly about what you are doing and why. To recognize that you have more agency than you realize, and that exercising that agency begins not with action but with awareness. Awareness of how you are currently living. Awareness of whether that aligns with what you actually want. Awareness that change is possible, not through force, but through thought. The invisible cost of living without strategy extends into every corner of your existence in ways you may not immediately recognize. It shows up in the decisions you avoid making because you have no framework for evaluating them. It manifests in the opportunities you miss because you are too consumed with maintaining your current state to notice what else might be possible. It appears in the relationships that slowly deteriorate because you never make time for them, always telling yourself you will get to them later, after things settle down. Consider how strategy operates in domains where its presence is obvious. A chess player does not simply respond to their opponent's moves. They think several moves ahead. They understand patterns. They know which pieces to sacrifice and which to protect. They have a theory of the game that guides their decisions. Remove that strategic thinking, and you are left with someone who can move pieces according to the rules but has no coherent approach to winning. They are playing, but they are not really competing. The same principle applies to life, but with higher stakes and far less visibility. You are making moves every day, but without a strategic framework, those moves are not building toward anything. They are simply responses to immediate circumstances. You take the job that pays more even though it pulls you away from work you find meaningful. You say yes to social obligations that drain you because you fear disappointing others. You spend money on things that provide momentary satisfaction but do nothing to advance your long-term well-being. Each decision, taken individually, seems reasonable. But collectively, they add up to a life that feels increasingly misaligned with who you are and what you want. The reason most people do not recognize this misalignment is because they have nothing to compare it to. Reactive living is the default mode. It is what everyone around you is doing. It is what the culture celebrates. So when you feel exhausted, scattered, or vaguely dissatisfied, you assume this is just how life is. You tell yourself everyone feels this way. And in a sense, you are right. But that does not make it inevitable. There is a particular kind of fatigue that comes from living reactively, and it is different from the fatigue that comes from genuine, purposeful effort. When you are working towards something that matters to you, even if the work is difficult, there is a quality of engagement that sustains you. You feel tired at the end of the day, but it is a clean tiredness. You can look back and see what you accomplished and why it mattered. Reactive living produces a different kind of exhaustion. It is the tiredness of someone who has been running all day but cannot remember where they were trying to go. It is depletion without meaning, effort without purpose. This distinction matters because it points to something fundamental about human psychology. We are not energized by ease. We are energized by meaning. The problem with reactive living is not that it is too hard. It is that it is too empty. You can handle difficulty when it is connected to something you care about. What you cannot handle, at least not indefinitely, is grinding away at tasks that feel disconnected from any larger purpose. Strategy provides that sense of purpose, but it does so in a way that is practical rather than abstract. It is not about finding your one true calling or discovering some grand cosmic purpose. It is about getting clear on what you want your life to look like and then making decisions that move you in that direction. This sounds simple, but it is not easy, primarily because it requires you to define what you want in concrete terms rather than vague aspirations. Most people, when asked what they want, offer answers that are either too broad to be useful or too conventional to be authentic. They want to be successful, happy, financially secure, respected. These are not real answers. They are placeholders. They sound like goals, but they provide no guidance for decision-making because they do not specify what success or happiness or security actually means to you personally. They do not help you choose between competing options or prioritize among limited resources. Strategic thinking begins with the willingness to get specific. Not just about what you want to achieve, but about why you want to achieve it and what you are willing to trade off to get there. It requires you to examine the stories you have been telling yourself about what constitutes a good life and determine whether those stories are actually yours or whether you inherited them from family, culture, or circumstance. This examination is uncomfortable because it often reveals that you have been pursuing things you do not actually want. You have been climbing a ladder only to discover it is leaning against the wrong wall. You have been working toward a version of success that was defined by someone else. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. You have to decide whether to keep going or to change course, and both options come with costs. But here is what makes strategic living different from simply drifting through existence: it gives you ownership of those costs. When you choose something consciously, when you decide that this particular trade-off is worth it to you, the difficulty becomes bearable. You are not just enduring hardship. You are investing in something that matters to you. The pain has a purpose. The sacrifice has meaning. The person who lives strategically still faces challenges, setbacks, and disappointments. Life does not become easy just because you are intentional about it. But the quality of the struggle changes. You are no longer fighting a vague sense of dissatisfaction or trying to keep up with undefined expectations. You are working on problems you have chosen to work on, in service of outcomes you have decided matter. This does not eliminate frustration, but it eliminates a particular kind of futility that comes from not knowing why you are doing what you are doing. Another invisible cost of living without strategy is the way it limits your ability to learn from experience. When you are purely reactive, every situation feels unique. You handle each crisis as it comes, but you do not step back to notice patterns or extract principles. You solve the same problems over and over again without developing systems that would prevent those problems from recurring. You remain perpetually in the weeds, never gaining the altitude needed to see the landscape clearly. Strategic thinking, by contrast, is inherently reflective. It requires you to look at your experiences and ask what they reveal about what works and what does not. It demands that you update your mental models based on new information. It pushes you to think in terms of patterns and principles rather than isolated incidents. This reflective capacity is what allows you to improve over time rather than simply repeat the same cycles. There is also a social dimension to living without strategy that deserves attention. When you do not have clarity about your priorities, you become vulnerable to other people's agendas. You take on projects because someone asked you to, not because they align with your goals. You attend events because you feel obligated, not because you want to be there. You allow your time and energy to be allocated by whoever makes the loudest claim on your attention. This is not generosity. It is abdication. The irony is that people who lack strategic clarity often pride themselves on being helpful, flexible, and accommodating. They are the ones who always say yes, who never let anyone down, who can be counted on to pitch in. But this reliability comes at a cost. It means they are always available for other people's priorities but never available for their own. It means they end up living in the margins of their own lives, squeezing in what matters to them only after everyone else has been served. This pattern is particularly insidious because it feels virtuous. It is easy to mistake self-sacrifice for selflessness, to confuse the inability to say no with generosity. But there is nothing noble about neglecting your own well-being and aspirations in order to meet the endless demands of others. There is nothing admirable about being so accommodating that you accommodate yourself out of your own life. Strategic living requires you to develop the capacity to say no, not out of selfishness, but out of a clear understanding of what you are saying yes to. When you know what matters to you, declining things that do not serve your priorities becomes easier. It is not about being rigid or ungenerous. It is about being deliberate. It is about recognizing that every yes to something is a no to something else, and making sure those trade-offs are ones you are willing to live with. The chapters that follow are designed to help you develop that awareness and translate it into a way of living that feels less like drowning and more like swimming. Not because swimming is easy, but because it involves moving in a direction you have chosen rather than simply thrashing against the current. The goal is not perfection. It is not optimization. It is simply this: a life that feels more like yours. Chapter 2: Strategic Thinking, From Short-Term Reactions to Long-Term Moves. Strategic thinking is not a gift reserved for the intellectually exceptional. It is not a rare cognitive ability that some people are born with and others are not. It is a way of seeing, a shift in perspective that anyone can develop once they understand what they are looking for. The difference between someone who thinks strategically and someone who does not has little to do with intelligence and everything to do with how they frame time. Most of us operate within a narrow temporal window. We think about today, maybe tomorrow, occasionally next week. Our mental horizon extends only as far as the next deadline, the next obligation, the next problem demanding immediate attention. This is not a character flaw. It is a natural response to the structure of modern life, which constantly pulls our attention toward what is urgent and away from what is important. But it is also a trap, because the decisions that shape your life most profoundly are rarely the urgent ones. Consider two people facing the same situation. Both are offered a promotion that requires relocating to a different city. The first person focuses on the immediate implications: the salary increase, the disruption of moving, the logistics of finding a new place to live. They weigh the short-term costs against the short-term benefits and make a decision based on which side feels heavier in this moment. The second person considers the same factors but also asks different questions. Where do I want to be in 5 years? What skills will this role help me develop? How does this move fit into the larger arc of my career? What kind of life am I trying to build, and does this opportunity move me closer to that or further away? The first person is thinking tactically. The second is thinking strategically. Both might arrive at the same decision, but the process is fundamentally different. The tactical thinker is responding to the situation as it presents itself. The strategic thinker is evaluating the situation within a larger context. One is reacting. The other is choosing. This distinction becomes clearer when you understand what strategists mean by time horizon. Your time horizon is the furthest point into the future that informs your present decisions. For most people, that horizon is measured in days or weeks. They think about what needs to happen soon, what is coming up next, what they need to handle before it becomes a problem. This is not useless thinking. It keeps life functional. But it is insufficient for building anything that lasts. Extending your time horizon does not mean ignoring the present or living in some abstract future. It means recognizing that the present is shaped by decisions made in the past, and the future will be shaped by decisions made now. It means understanding that some actions pay off immediately while others take years to compound into something meaningful. It means learning to hold multiple timescales in your mind simultaneously: what matters today, what matters this year, what matters over the next decade. Think about physical fitness. If your time horizon is a single day, you might choose comfort over exercise because the benefit of movement today is barely noticeable while the discomfort is immediate. If your time horizon extends to months or years, the calculation changes. You recognize that consistent movement, repeated over time, produces outcomes that single sessions never could. The person with the longer time horizon does not possess more willpower. They simply see consequences that the short-term thinker cannot. This applies to every domain where success requires sustained effort over time. Learning a skill, building a business, developing deep relationships, accumulating knowledge, creating financial security, none of these happen quickly. They are all products of decisions that make sense only when you extend your view beyond the immediate. The person who thinks in days struggles with these pursuits because the payoff feels too distant to justify the effort. The person who thinks in years finds them not only manageable but inevitable. The interesting thing about time horizons is that they are not fixed. You can train yourself to think further ahead, and doing so changes what you notice and how you act. When you start considering 5-year consequences, certain choices that seemed appealing lose their shine. Other options, previously invisible or dismissed as too slow, begin to make sense. Your decisions shift not because you suddenly acquired more discipline, but because you adjusted the frame through which you are viewing your options. This is why strategic thinking feels less like a skill and more like a lens. You are not learning new information. You are learning to see information you already have in a different way. The same situation can be evaluated through multiple time horizons, and each one reveals different implications. The strategic thinker develops the habit of checking their decisions against multiple timescales before committing. They ask not only whether something makes sense today but whether it will make sense next year, 5 years from now, a decade out. Most people do not do this because they have never been shown how. We are taught to plan, to set goals, to think ahead. But we are rarely taught to think across different temporal scales simultaneously. We are encouraged to have 5-year plans, but not to consider how today's choices connect to those plans. We are told to think long-term, but given no framework for translating that abstraction into concrete decisions. So we end up with vague aspirations about the future while making immediate choices that undermine those aspirations, and we cannot figure out why we are not making progress. The failure is not in the execution. It is in the thinking. You cannot execute your way out of a flawed strategy. You cannot work hard enough to compensate for decisions made without adequate perspective. Effort matters, but only when directed intelligently. And intelligence, in this context, is not about being clever. It is about being clear on what you are optimizing for and over what time frame. Consider the difference between someone trying to get rich quickly and someone building wealth over time. The first person is drawn to high-risk, high-reward opportunities. They chase trends, look for shortcuts, seek the one big score that will change everything. Some of them succeed, but most do not, and even those who do often find that sudden wealth is as easily lost as it was gained. The second person thinks differently. They focus on sustainable practices, consistent saving, compound growth, learning skills that remain valuable, building systems that generate returns over time. They are not trying to win the lottery. They are trying to create conditions where success becomes probable rather than merely possible. Both are pursuing wealth, but one is gambling while the other is strategizing. The gambler needs luck. The strategist needs patience. The gambler is optimizing for maximum return in minimum time. The strategist is optimizing for reliability and compounding. These are not just different approaches. They are different ways of thinking about what success means and how it is achieved. Strategic thinking recognizes that some of the most valuable investments you can make have no immediate return. Reading a difficult book, learning a new skill, having a hard conversation, building a habit, strengthening a relationship. These things cost time and energy now for benefits that emerge later, sometimes much later. If you evaluate them on a short time horizon, they often look like poor uses of resources. But extend the horizon, and the calculation flips. The book you read today might contain an insight you use 5 years from now. The skill you develop slowly becomes a competitive advantage. The relationship you invest in becomes a source of support when you need it most. The person who thinks only in the short term cannot see this. They are trapped in a perpetual present where the only rational choice is to pursue immediate gratification or address immediate problems. They are not stupid or lazy. They simply lack the temporal perspective needed to make choices that pay off over longer arcs of time. And because our culture overwhelmingly rewards and celebrates short-term wins, they have little incentive to develop that perspective. You see this most clearly in how people respond to setbacks. When something goes wrong, the short-term thinker focuses on fixing the immediate problem. They address the symptom without examining the cause. They put out the fire without asking why fires keep starting. The strategic thinker does fix the immediate issue, but they also step back and ask what this setback reveals about their approach. They use the problem as information. They adjust their system rather than just their action. Over time, this difference compounds. The tactical thinker keeps solving the same problems. The strategic thinker eliminates entire categories of problems by changing the conditions that produce them. This does not mean strategic thinkers never make mistakes or face unexpected challenges. It means they have a framework for learning from those experiences and integrating the lessons into their future thinking. They treat each decision as part of a larger pattern, not as an isolated event. They recognize that a single choice matters less than the direction established by a series of choices over time. One of the clearest markers of strategic thinking is the ability to delay gratification intelligently. Notice that qualifier, intelligently. Delaying gratification for its own sake is pointless. Suffering now for no clear future benefit is not strategic. It is just masochism. Strategic delay means choosing a smaller reward now in exchange for a larger reward later, but only when you have reason to believe the future reward is both real and worth waiting for. It requires judgment, not just willpower. This is where many people misunderstand what it means to think long-term. They assume it means sacrificing the present for some distant future, denying yourself now in hopes of deferred happiness. But that is not strategy. That is just postponement. Strategic thinking is about making present choices that serve both your current well-being and your future possibilities. It is about finding decisions that are good for you now and better for you later. These are not always available, but they are more common than most people realize once you start looking for them. Take the decision to read regularly. Reading is enjoyable in the moment for many people, but it also compounds over time. The knowledge you gain, the vocabulary you build, the mental models you develop, these accumulate and become increasingly valuable as the years pass. This is an example of a choice that serves multiple time horizons simultaneously. It is pleasant today and powerful over decades. The strategic thinker looks for these kinds of decisions because they do not require sacrifice. They require only the recognition that some activities have a different temporal structure than others. Another characteristic of strategic thinking is the willingness to make decisions based on probabilities rather than certainties. Short-term thinking wants guarantees. It wants to know exactly what will happen if you take a certain action. But the future is inherently uncertain, especially over longer time horizons. The strategic thinker accepts this uncertainty and learns to make decisions anyway, based on what seems most likely rather than what is guaranteed. They understand that being approximately right over the long run beats being precisely right in the short term. This is why successful people often seem to make decisions that do not make sense to others. They are optimizing for different timescales. They are willing to endure short-term costs for long-term benefits that are not yet visible. They are playing a different game, one where the score is not tallied daily but over years or decades. And because most people are not thinking on those timescales, they cannot understand the logic of those decisions. The ability to think across multiple time horizons simultaneously is not innate. It is developed through practice. You start by simply noticing what time horizon you are currently using when you make decisions. Are you thinking about today? This month? This year? 5 years out? Just becoming aware of your default setting is the first step. Most people discover they default to very short horizons without realizing it. Once you have that awareness, you can begin experimenting with different horizons. When facing a decision, ask yourself, what would I choose if I were optimizing for this week? What would I choose if I were optimizing for this year? What about 5 years? 10 years? These questions will often produce different answers, and that divergence is useful information. It shows you where short-term and long-term interests align and where they conflict. Strategic thinking is about navigating those conflicts intelligently rather than ignoring them or defaulting to one time frame exclusively. You also start noticing that some decisions are irreversible or very costly to reverse, while others are easily adjusted. Strategic thinkers are cautious with the first category and experimental with the second. They do not agonize over choices that can be easily changed. They save their deliberation for decisions that will be difficult to undo. This is not about perfectionism. It is about appropriate allocation of mental energy. There is a common misconception that strategic thinking requires you to have everything figured out, to know exactly where you want to be in 5 or 10 years. But that is not how it works. You do not need perfect clarity about the distant future. You need only enough clarity to distinguish directions. You do not need to know your precise destination. You need only to know whether you are moving toward the kind of life you want or away from it. That is sufficient to guide most decisions. Think of it like navigation. You do not need to know every turn on a cross-country road trip before you start driving. You need to know your general direction and trust that you will figure out the specific route as you go. Strategic thinking operates the same way. You establish a general direction based on what matters to you, and then you make decisions that keep you moving in that direction, adjusting as you learn more about the terrain. The person who insists on perfect clarity before taking action never starts. The person who acts without any sense of direction wanders aimlessly. Strategic thinking is the middle path, enough direction to guide your choices, enough flexibility to adapt as circumstances change. It is not about control. It is about intentionality within uncertainty. This brings us to perhaps the most important insight about strategic thinking: it transforms your relationship with time itself. When you are trapped in short-term thinking, time feels scarce and urgent. Every moment is consumed by what needs to happen now. There is never enough time because you are always behind, always catching up, always reacting to the latest demand. But when you develop the capacity to think across longer horizons, time begins to feel different. It becomes a resource you can invest rather than something you are constantly losing. You start to see that you have more time than you thought, not because your days got longer, but because you are measuring value differently. A day spent learning something difficult feels less like wasted time and more like an investment whose returns will compound. A conversation that does not lead anywhere immediately feels less like an inefficient use of an hour and more like relationship building that might matter years from now. You become less frantic because you are not trying to extract maximum value from every single moment. You are playing a longer game where the wins accumulate gradually. This does not mean you become passive or complacent. Strategic thinkers can be intensely driven. But their drive is channeled differently. They are not in a constant state of urgency because they understand that most things worth doing take time. They are patient with the process while remaining impatient with distractions. They can wait for results without waiting passively. They stay active and engaged, but their activity is organized around a longer arc than most people can see. The final thing to understand about strategic thinking is that it is not primarily about making better predictions. You cannot predict the future, and trying to do so is often counterproductive. Strategic thinking is about making decisions today that give you more options tomorrow. It is about creating flexibility and resilience rather than betting everything on a single outcome. It is about positioning yourself so that when opportunities or challenges arise, you are ready to respond effectively. This is why people who think strategically often seem lucky. They are not predicting the future. They are preparing for multiple possible futures. When something good happens, they are positioned to take advantage of it. When something bad happens, they have systems in place to absorb the shock. Luck is not random chance. It is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and strategic thinking is the practice of perpetual preparation without knowing exactly what you are preparing for. In the end, the shift from short-term reactions to long-term moves is not about becoming a different person. It is about learning to ask different questions. Instead of asking what feels best right now, you learn to ask what will matter most over time. Instead of focusing only on what is urgent, you learn to identify what is important. Instead of reacting to whatever comes your way, you learn to choose your direction deliberately. These are not complicated changes. They are shifts in perspective. But those shifts, repeated consistently over time, produce lives that look radically different from where they started. Not through force, but through vision. Not through effort alone, but through thought. Chapter 3: How to Build Strategic Planning into Your Personal Life. Most people approach personal planning the wrong way. They set goals. They write down targets. They declare what they want to achieve by certain dates. Then they work backward from those endpoints, creating action plans filled with milestones and metrics. This feels productive. It looks like strategy. But it is often just ambition dressed up in the language of planning, and ambition without wisdom rarely leads anywhere sustainable. The problem with goal-based planning is that it assumes you know exactly what you want and that the path to getting there is reasonably predictable. Neither assumption holds true for most of life's important domains. You do not know precisely what version of success will satisfy you until you get closer to it. You cannot anticipate all the variables that will shift between now and your target date. And most critically, goals focus your attention on endpoints while leaving the daily reality of getting there underspecified. Strategic planning for your personal life works differently. It starts not with destinations but with directions. A direction is not a specific outcome you are trying to reach. It is an orientation you are trying to maintain. If a goal is a point on a map, a direction is a compass heading. The difference matters more than it seems. Consider someone who sets a goal to write a book. They decide they will finish a manuscript by a specific date. They break this down into chapters, then into weekly word counts. This is goal-based planning. Now consider someone who decides they want to move in the direction of becoming a writer. They do not commit to finishing a book by a certain date. Instead, they commit to writing regularly, to improving their craft, to engaging with the practice of writing itself. They are oriented toward writing as an ongoing part of their life rather than fixated on a single outcome. The goal-oriented person might finish their book, or they might not. If they do, they will immediately face the question of what comes next. If they do not, they will experience their entire effort as failure. The direction-oriented person is already succeeding every time they sit down to write. They are moving in the direction they chose. Whether any single piece of writing achieves external success becomes less critical because the process itself is aligned with their identity and values. This is not semantics. It is a fundamental shift in how you structure your relationship with effort and progress. Goals are binary. You hit them or you miss them. Directions are continuous. You can always assess whether you are still moving the way you intended, and you can make adjustments without experiencing failure. This makes direction-based planning more resilient and more sustainable over the long periods of time that meaningful change requires. Setting a direction begins with getting clear on what you actually want more of in your life and what you want less of. Not in the abstract, but in concrete, felt terms. Do you want more time alone or more time with others? More intellectual challenge or more ease? More creative expression or more financial security? These are not right or wrong answers. They are diagnostic questions. The point is to identify the qualities of experience you are trying to increase and the ones you are trying to decrease. Once you have that clarity, the question becomes, what direction of movement increases the former and decreases the latter? This is your strategic direction. It is not a goal you can achieve and check off. It is an ongoing orientation that guides decisions. Every choice you face can be evaluated against this direction. Does this move me toward more of what I want or away from it? Does this align with where I am trying to go or pull me somewhere else? This kind of directional clarity is what allows you to say no without guilt and yes with confidence. You are not rejecting opportunities because you are closed-minded or risk-averse. You are declining them because they point in a different direction than the one you have chosen. You are not accepting every chance that comes your way. You are selecting the ones that move you where you want to go. This is not about being rigid. It is about being coherent. But direction alone is not enough. You also need systems. Systems are the structures you put in place that make movement in your chosen direction more likely. They are not action plans. They are not to-do lists. They are the routines, habits, environments, and processes that shape your behavior without requiring constant willpower or decision-making. Think about someone who wants to move in the direction of better health. They could set a goal to lose a specific amount of weight by a certain date. Or they could build systems that make healthy choices easier and more automatic. They could stock their kitchen with nutritious food, establish a regular sleep schedule, find a form of exercise they actually enjoy, connect with people who prioritize health. These systems do not guarantee any specific outcome, but they make progress in the desired direction far more probable than relying on willpower alone. Systems work because they operate at the level of process rather than outcome. You do not have to stay motivated to follow a system. You just have to show up and do the thing the system specifies. The system handles the decision-making. This is valuable because motivation is an unreliable resource. It comes and goes. Systems persist regardless of how motivated you feel on any given day. They convert intentions into structures, and structures are more durable than feelings. The most powerful systems are the ones that address leverage points. A leverage point is a place where a small input produces disproportionate results. In your personal life, leverage points are often found in daily routines, environmental design, and relationship structures. Change how you spend your mornings, and you change how you spend your days. Change who you spend time with, and you change who you become. Change what is visible and accessible in your environment, and you change what you naturally gravitate toward. Strategic planning identifies these leverage points and then builds systems around them. You do not try to change everything at once. You find the 1 or 2 points where intervention will cascade into broader change, and you focus there. This is not about doing more. It is about doing less but doing it in the right places. Energy, attention, and time are the 3 fundamental resources you are managing, and most people manage them poorly because they treat them as if they were interchangeable or infinite. They are neither. Each has its own dynamics, its own patterns of depletion and renewal, its own strategic implications. Energy is not just physical. It is emotional, mental, and creative as well. You can have time available but no energy to do anything meaningful with it. You can be busy all day and end it exhausted yet unproductive. Strategic planning recognizes that energy management is prior to time management. There is no point scheduling something during a period when you consistently lack the energy to do it well. You need to understand your own energy patterns, when you are sharpest, when you fade, what depletes you, what renews you. Then you design your commitments around those patterns rather than fighting them. Attention is different from time. You can spend an hour on something and give it almost no attention. You can spend 15 minutes fully focused and accomplish more than most people do in a day. Attention is your capacity to direct and sustain mental focus, and it is increasingly scarce in a world engineered to fragment it. Strategic planning treats attention as the most valuable resource you have. It protects it jealously. It creates conditions that make deep attention possible and eliminates conditions that make it impossible. Time is the resource everyone thinks about, but even here, most people think about it incorrectly. They try to manage time by filling it more efficiently, cramming more activities into the same hours. But time is not a container to be filled. It is a medium through which you move. The question is not how much you can fit into your time but whether what you are doing with your time is moving you in the direction you have chosen. Strategic time management is about subtraction, not addition. It is about doing fewer things so you can do the right things properly. These 3 resources interact. When you protect your attention, you use your energy more efficiently. When you manage your energy well, you have more capacity to sustain attention. When you allocate your time strategically, both attention and energy are less fragmented. The goal is not to optimize each resource independently but to create a system where they support each other. This brings us to the architecture of priorities, which is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of personal strategic planning. Most people think about priorities as a ranked list. They try to identify what is most important, second most important, and so on. Then they attempt to allocate their resources proportionally. This rarely works because it ignores how priorities actually function in real life. Priorities are not just about importance. They are about sequence, timing, and exclusivity. Some things need to happen before other things become possible. Some things require concentrated effort during specific windows. Some things cannot coexist with other things, not because they are incompatible in theory but because they both demand resources you do not have in sufficient quantity to pursue simultaneously. Strategic priority architecture recognizes these constraints. It does not ask you to rank everything you care about. It asks you to identify what needs your focus now, given where you are and where you are trying to go. It accepts that you cannot pursue everything that matters to you at the same time. It makes peace with the fact that some valuable things will have to wait or will never happen at all. This is not failure. This is realism. The person who tries to give equal attention to career, health, relationships, personal growth, hobbies, social life, and community involvement is not ambitious. They are confused. No one has sufficient resources to meaningfully advance in all these domains simultaneously. The strategic approach is to identify which 2 or 3 areas matter most during this particular season of your life and concentrate there. Not because the others are unimportant, but because you are finite. This requires a level of honesty that most people find uncomfortable. It means acknowledging that you cannot have everything you want, at least not all at once. It means accepting trade-offs consciously rather than pretending they do not exist. It means saying no to good things so you can say yes to great things. And it means being willing to disappoint others, and yourself, in service of a larger coherence. One of the most powerful concepts in strategic planning is the idea of letting certain areas of life run on maintenance mode while you focus elsewhere. Maintenance mode does not mean neglect. It means identifying the minimum viable investment required to keep something stable and healthy while you direct your growth energy toward other priorities. You maintain your friendships without trying to deepen all of them at once. You maintain your health without training for a marathon. You maintain your skills without pushing for mastery in every domain. This is not about lowering your standards. It is about being realistic about your capacity and strategic about its deployment. The person who tries to excel at everything simultaneously ends up mediocre at everything. The person who chooses their focus areas deliberately and maintains everything else can actually achieve excellence in the domains they prioritize. There is also the question of how to choose those focus areas. The answer is not purely analytical. It is not just about what will produce the best outcomes or what makes the most logical sense. It has to include what calls to you, what you find yourself thinking about when your mind wanders, what you are curious about, what you are willing to struggle with. Strategic planning is not about optimizing your life according to someone else's metrics. It is about creating a life that feels worth living to you. This means your strategic priorities might look completely different from someone else's, and that is not only acceptable but necessary. There is no universal template for a well-lived life. There are only individuals trying to figure out what matters to them and how to organize their limited resources in service of those things. The strategy that works for you is the one that reflects your values, your circumstances, your constraints, and your aspirations. It will not look like anyone else's, and it should not. Building this kind of strategic framework into your personal life is not a one-time exercise. It is an ongoing practice. You set a direction, you build systems, you allocate resources, you focus on your priorities. Then you live with those choices for a while. You notice what works and what does not. You gather information about yourself and your circumstances. You adjust. You refine. You sometimes change direction entirely when you realize you are headed somewhere you no longer want to go. This iterative quality is essential. Your first attempt at strategic planning will not be perfect. It cannot be, because you do not yet know what you do not know. You have to start with your best guess about what matters and how to pursue it, then update that guess as you learn. This is not a flaw in the method. It is how the method works. Strategy is not a plan you execute. It is a hypothesis you test. The person who waits for perfect clarity before committing to a direction never starts. The person who commits to a direction without allowing for adjustment gets stuck pursuing something that no longer serves them. Strategic planning occupies the middle ground, strong enough to guide action, flexible enough to evolve with understanding. There is one more element that makes personal strategic planning work: the willingness to focus on the right thing rather than trying to do everything. This sounds obvious, but it contradicts deeply ingrained cultural messages about maximizing productivity, keeping all your options open, and never missing an opportunity. Strategic focus requires you to reject those messages. It requires you to accept that every yes is a no to something else, and to make those trade-offs consciously rather than pretending they do not exist. Focus does not mean narrowness. It does not mean abandoning curiosity or flexibility. It means understanding that depth requires concentration, and concentration requires saying no to most things so you can fully engage with the few things that matter most. The person who tries to do everything ends up doing nothing particularly well. The person who focuses on the right things, even just one or two, can achieve outcomes that look exceptional from the outside but are simply the natural result of sustained, strategic effort. The right thing is not a universal constant. It is specific to you, to this moment in your life, to your particular combination of circumstances and aspirations. Identifying it requires honest self-examination and a willingness to think for yourself rather than simply adopting what others consider important. It requires asking what success would actually feel like to you, not just what it would look like to others. And it requires accepting that your answer might be different from the conventional wisdom about how life should be lived. Once you know what the right thing is, the rest of strategic planning becomes clearer. You build systems that support it. You allocate your energy, attention, and time toward it. You structure your priorities around it. You let other things run on maintenance mode. You say no to distractions. You create an environment that makes movement in your chosen direction the path of least resistance. This is not about perfection. You will still get pulled off course. You will still waste time on things that do not matter. You will still face unexpected obstacles and setbacks. But you will do so less often, and you will notice more quickly when it happens. You will have a reference point for evaluating whether you are still moving where you intended. You will have a framework for making corrections without experiencing the entire endeavor as failure. Strategic planning in your personal life is ultimately about taking ownership of how your life unfolds. Not control, because you cannot control outcomes. But ownership, which means accepting responsibility for the direction you are moving, the systems you build, the priorities you set, the trade-offs you make. It means recognizing that the shape your life takes is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in creating, one decision at a time, over years and decades. The alternative is to drift, to react, to let the current take you wherever it wants. Some people drift into lives they find satisfying. Most do not. Strategic planning is the practice of choosing your direction deliberately, then swimming in that direction even when the current pushes another way. It does not guarantee you will arrive at some predetermined destination. But it dramatically increases the probability that you will end up somewhere you actually want to be. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from this approach, though it might not look like freedom from the outside. To someone accustomed to keeping all options open, strategic focus can appear restrictive. You are choosing not to pursue certain paths. You are declining opportunities that might have led somewhere interesting. You are accepting constraints that you could theoretically avoid. But this is where most people misunderstand what freedom actually means in practice. Freedom is not the absence of constraints. It is the presence of meaningful choice within constraints. The person who refuses all constraints ends up paralyzed by possibility. They can do anything, so they do nothing in particular. They remain perpetually at the starting line, surveying all possible directions, never committing to movement because commitment means foreclosing other options. This is not freedom. This is imprisonment by indecision. Real freedom comes from choosing your constraints deliberately. When you decide what matters most to you and build your life around that decision, you are not limiting yourself. You are liberating yourself from the tyranny of endless options. You are trading the anxiety of infinite possibility for the clarity of chosen direction. You are accepting that you cannot do everything so you can actually do something. This distinction becomes clearer when you observe people who have built strategic frameworks into their lives versus those who have not. The strategic person appears more constrained in some ways. They have established routines. They have clear priorities. They say no to many things. But watch them over time, and you notice something striking: they actually accomplish what they set out to accomplish. They make visible progress in the directions they care about. They build things that last. They develop capabilities that compound. The person without strategic constraints appears more free. They are spontaneous, flexible, open to whatever comes. They keep their options open. They never commit too deeply to any single path. But watch them over the same period, and you notice they remain essentially unchanged. They are busy, certainly. They are involved in many things. But they are not building toward anything in particular. Their life 5 years from now looks remarkably similar to their life today, just with different details filling the same general shape. The paradox is that strategic constraint produces expansion over time, while avoiding constraint produces stagnation. When you focus your resources on specific directions and build systems that support movement in those directions, you develop momentum. Small consistent actions compound into significant capabilities. You become someone who can do things you could not do before. You create options for yourself that did not previously exist. Your future self has more freedom, not less, because of the constraints your past self accepted. This compounding effect is invisible in the short term, which is why so many people never experience it. They evaluate decisions based on immediate freedom versus immediate constraint. They choose the option that keeps more doors open right now. But keeping doors open has a cost. It diffuses your energy across too many possibilities. It prevents you from going deep enough in any single direction to reach the point where real capability develops. Think about skill acquisition. You cannot become genuinely skilled at something by dabbling. You cannot develop expertise by sampling widely and committing to nothing. Skill requires sustained focus over extended periods. It requires accepting the constraint of concentration. The person who wants to preserve all their options by never specializing never becomes exceptional at anything. The person who chooses a direction and commits to it develops capabilities that create new possibilities. They constrain themselves into greater freedom. This same principle applies to relationships, to career, to creative work, to any domain where depth matters. Surface-level engagement with many things produces surface-level results. Deep engagement with a few things produces transformation. Strategic planning is the practice of choosing where to go deep and accepting that going deep in one place means staying shallow in others. It is trading breadth for depth in the areas that matter most to you. The implementation of this kind of planning is simpler than most people expect, though simple does not mean easy. You start by getting clear on your direction. What do you want more of in your life? What do you want less of? What feels important to you, not in the abstract but in your actual lived experience? These questions do not have obvious answers, and they require genuine reflection rather than quick responses. But once you have those answers, even provisionally, everything else follows. You then identify the systems that would support movement in your chosen direction. What routines, habits, or structures would make the desired behavior more automatic? What environmental changes would eliminate friction? What relationships would reinforce rather than undermine your priorities? You do not need to implement everything at once. You start with 1 or 2 leverage points and build from there. Next, you make decisions about resource allocation. Given your finite energy, attention, and time, What deserves the most of each? What can run on maintenance mode? What needs to be eliminated entirely? You create an architecture of priorities that reflects your actual capacity rather than your aspirational capacity. You design a life you can actually live rather than one that looks good on paper but requires superhuman consistency. Then you live with these choices for a period. Not forever, but long enough to gather real information about whether they work. You notice what produces results and what does not. You pay attention to how you feel moving in this direction. You stay alert for signs that your initial choices need adjustment. You treat the entire endeavor as an experiment rather than a life sentence. Over time, patterns emerge. You discover which systems serve you and which create friction. You learn which priorities were genuine and which were borrowed from external expectations. You develop a clearer sense of what constitutes the right thing for you. And you adjust your strategic framework accordingly. This is not backtracking or failure. This is learning. This is the process working as designed. The ultimate test of strategic planning is not whether you achieve specific outcomes. It is whether you feel like you are living your life or life is living you. It is whether you experience a sense of agency and direction or a sense of being carried along by forces outside your control. It is whether your daily actions connect to something larger than themselves or feel like isolated responses to immediate demands. When strategic planning works, you know it not because you suddenly become successful by conventional metrics, though that often follows. You know it because you feel different in relation to your own life. You feel less fragmented, less scattered, less perpetually behind. You feel more coherent, more intentional, more like you are swimming rather than drowning. The specific outcomes matter less than this shift in your internal experience of how you are moving through time. This is not a permanent state. You will still have periods of confusion, overwhelm, and drift. Strategic planning does not eliminate those experiences. It gives you a way to navigate them and return to chosen direction more quickly. It provides a reference point when you inevitably get pulled off course. It reminds you what you are trying to do and why it matters to you. And that reminder, accessed repeatedly over years, shapes a life that looks and feels substantially different from one lived reactively. The question is not whether you have the capacity to think and act strategically. You do. Everyone does. The question is whether you are willing to exercise that capacity. Whether you are willing to choose constraints that serve you. Whether you are willing to say no to preserve your yes. Whether you are willing to think for yourself about what constitutes a life worth living rather than accepting default answers. Whether you are willing to trade the appearance of keeping all options open for the reality of making meaningful progress in chosen directions. These are not comfortable choices. They require confronting the fact that you cannot have everything. They require accepting trade-offs that others might not understand or approve of. They require believing that the direction you have chosen is worth the things you are giving up to move in that direction. But discomfort is not the same as wrongness. Sometimes discomfort is just the feeling of doing something unfamiliar. Sometimes it is the growing pain of becoming someone slightly different than who you have been. Strategic planning in your personal life is not about optimizing yourself into some idealized version of productivity. It is about creating conditions where the things that matter to you can actually happen. It is about moving from a life of perpetual reaction to a life of considered response. It is about recognizing that you have more influence over how your life unfolds than you have been exercising, and choosing to exercise it. Not perfectly, not all at once, but deliberately, consistently, over time. That is all strategy ever is, thought made actionable, repeated until it compounds into transformation. Chapter 4: Decision-Making, Risk and Probability Management. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from deciding too much. You have felt it before, that mental friction that appears when you stand at a crossroads, unable to move forward because you cannot see which path leads where. The weight is not in the choice itself, but in the demand you place on that choice to be perfect, to be certain, to be the one decision that eliminates all future regret. This is where most planning efforts collapse, not from a lack of ambition or discipline, but from a fundamental misunderstanding of what decision-making actually requires. We treat decisions as if they were mathematical proofs, problems with singular correct answers waiting to be discovered through sufficient analysis. We tell ourselves that if we gather enough information, consider enough angles, weigh enough variables, the right path will reveal itself with clarity. And so we wait. We research. We deliberate. And while we wait for certainty to arrive, life continues to unfold around us, indifferent to our need for guarantees. The truth that strategic thinking reveals is simpler and more uncomfortable: certainty does not exist. Not in the way we want it to. Every decision you make is a bet placed on an uncertain future, a future shaped by forces you cannot fully predict or control. The question is not whether you can eliminate this uncertainty. You cannot. The question is whether you can learn to think clearly within it, to make choices that remain sound even when the future refuses to cooperate with your expectations. This is not a call to recklessness or impulsivity. It is an invitation to a different kind of mental framework, one that trades the pursuit of perfect decisions for the cultivation of resilient thinking. When you stop asking, "What is the right choice?" and start asking, "What can I navigate from here?" something shifts. The paralysis begins to lift. The path forward, while still uncertain, becomes visible. Consider for a moment how you currently approach an important decision. Perhaps it is a career transition, a relocation, a significant financial commitment, or a shift in a personal relationship. Notice the internal narrative that emerges. There is likely a voice that catalogs risks, that generates worst-case scenarios, that reminds you of past mistakes and their consequences. This voice is not your enemy. It is an ancient warning system, designed to keep you safe by making you cautious. But it operates on a logic suited for environments where danger was immediate and choices were binary: fight or flee, eat or starve, shelter or exposure. The decisions you face now are rarely binary. They unfold across time. They interact with other choices, with changing circumstances, with the decisions of others. A choice that seems wise today may prove limiting tomorrow, not because it was wrong, but because the context shifted. A risk you avoid may turn out to have been an opportunity missed, not because you lacked courage, but because you lacked a framework for evaluating what was truly at stake. What you need is not more information. You already have access to more information than any generation in human history, and yet decision-making has not become easier. If anything, the abundance of data has made it harder to discern signal from noise, to separate what matters from what merely feels urgent. What you need is a way of thinking that allows you to move forward without requiring certainty, to act with confidence even when the outcome remains unclear. This begins with a shift in how you conceptualize decisions themselves. Most people treat decisions as singular events, moments where you choose one path and close off all others. This framing creates enormous pressure because it suggests that every choice is final, every mistake permanent. But if you observe how strategic thinkers actually operate, you will notice something different. They treat decisions not as endpoints but as experiments, not as commitments carved in stone but as hypotheses to be tested. When you decide to pursue a particular direction, you are not declaring that this is the only viable path or even that it is the best path. You are simply saying, based on what I can observe and understand right now, this seems like a reasonable direction to explore. You are placing a bet, but you are also setting up conditions that will tell you, over time, whether that bet is paying off. You build in checkpoints. You remain attentive to feedback. You give yourself permission to adjust. This is what it means to think in probabilities rather than certainties. You do not ask yourself, "Will this work?" Because that question has no honest answer. Instead, you ask, "What are the likely outcomes, and can I navigate the range of possibilities that might unfold?" You recognize that the future is not a single line but a branching network of potential states, some more probable than others, but none guaranteed. Imagine you are considering a significant career shift. The traditional approach would be to analyze the decision exhaustively. List the pros and cons, research salary ranges, talk to people in the field, project where you might be in 5 years. All of this is useful, but it can also trap you. Because no matter how thorough your analysis, you cannot predict how you will feel in the new role 6 months in. You cannot foresee the reorganization that might happen next year, the colleague who becomes a mentor, the project that ignites a passion you did not know you had. If you wait for certainty about these unknowns, you will never move. But if you shift your frame, the decision becomes more manageable. You ask instead, what is the probable range of outcomes, and which of those can I handle? You recognize that there is a scenario where the new role exceeds your expectations, a scenario where it meets them adequately, and a scenario where it disappoints. You think through what you would do in each case. You identify the signals that would tell you which scenario is unfolding. You set a timeline for evaluation. Suddenly, the decision is no longer about predicting the future perfectly. It is about equipping yourself to respond intelligently to whichever future actually arrives. This is strategic thinking in action. It does not eliminate risk. It changes your relationship to risk, transforming it from a barrier to motion into information you can use. There is a concept in decision theory called reversibility. Some decisions are easily reversible. If you try a new restaurant and dislike the meal, the cost is low, a single evening and the price of dinner. Other decisions are harder to reverse. If you sell your home and move across the country, unwinding that choice involves significant time, money, and emotional energy. Understanding the reversibility of a decision changes how much certainty you need before making it. For highly reversible decisions, you can afford to move quickly, to experiment, to learn by doing. You do not need exhaustive analysis because the cost of being wrong is manageable. For less reversible decisions, you invest more time in thinking through the implications, not because you are seeking perfect certainty, but because you are preparing yourself for the commitment involved. Many people invert this. They agonize over small, reversible choices as if they were life-altering, while rushing into major, irreversible commitments with minimal reflection. They spend weeks choosing a laptop but days deciding on a marriage. This inversion comes from a confusion between what feels urgent and what is actually significant. Strategic thinking helps you sort this out. It gives you a sense of proportion, a way to allocate your mental energy to the decisions that genuinely warrant it. But even when you have calibrated your effort appropriately, even when you have thought through probabilities and reversibility, there remains a deeper obstacle, the fear of regret. This fear is insidious because it disguises itself as prudence. It tells you that you are being careful, that you are protecting yourself, when in fact you are often just protecting yourself from the discomfort of having chosen. Regret is a powerful emotion, one that distorts memory and amplifies pain. When a decision leads to a negative outcome, the mind tends to rewrite history, convincing you that the warning signs were obvious, that you should have known better, that the mistake was avoidable if only you had been smarter or more careful. This narrative is rarely accurate. At the time of the decision, with the information you had and the person you were, the choice you made likely seemed reasonable. But hindsight erases the uncertainty you faced, replacing it with a false clarity that serves only to deepen your self-blame. The fear of future regret can paralyze you in the present. You hesitate to commit because you imagine the version of yourself who will look back and judge you harshly. You delay action because you want to avoid the pain of having been wrong. But this is a trap. Avoiding decisions does not spare you from regret. It simply shifts the regret to a different form, the regret of inaction, of opportunities missed, of time spent waiting for a certainty that never came. Strategic thinking offers a way out of this loop. It does so not by eliminating regret, but by changing how you frame it. If you understand that every decision is a probability-based bet, then a negative outcome does not mean you made a bad decision. It means you encountered an unfavorable probability. This distinction matters. A bad decision is one made with poor reasoning, inadequate consideration, or a misunderstanding of the stakes. An unfavorable outcome is simply what happens when the less likely scenario occurs. You can make a sound decision and still experience a disappointing result. This is not failure. This is life operating as it always does, with variability and chance woven into the fabric of every choice. If you can internalize this, you free yourself to act. You give yourself permission to move forward without the crushing burden of needing to be right every time. There is also the matter of how you hold your plans once you have made them. Many people treat a plan as a contract with the future, a set of commitments that must be honored regardless of changing circumstances. This rigidity feels like integrity. It feels like strength. But it is often just stubbornness wearing a respectable disguise. A plan is not a vow. It is a tool, a mental structure you build to guide action under current conditions. When those conditions change, the plan must change with them. This is not inconsistency. This is intelligence. The strategist understands that flexibility is not the opposite of commitment. It is the condition that makes commitment sustainable. Imagine a sailor navigating by the stars. She sets a course based on her destination and the prevailing winds. But she does not lock the wheel and walk away. She remains attentive. When the wind shifts, she adjusts the sails. When a storm appears on the horizon, she alters her route. Her destination has not changed, but her path to it adapts continuously to the reality she encounters. This is not a lack of commitment. It is seamanship. You can bring this same quality to your own planning. You set a direction based on your best current understanding. You take action. But you remain observant, willing to notice when the signals change, when the path you are on is leading somewhere other than where you intended. You build in moments of reflection, checkpoints where you ask yourself not am I doing what I said I would, but is this still taking me where I want to go? This requires a certain kind of honesty, a willingness to admit when something is not working. There is a sunk cost fallacy that often traps people in deteriorating situations. You have invested time, energy, or resources into a particular direction, and the thought of abandoning it feels like waste. So you continue, hoping that more investment will turn things around, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Strategic thinking cuts through this. It recognizes that the resources you have already spent are gone, regardless of what you do next. The only question that matters is, given where I am now, what is the best path forward? Sometimes that path involves continuing. Sometimes it involves a significant pivot. The decision should be based on present conditions and future probabilities, not on a desire to justify past choices. This is difficult because it requires you to separate your identity from your decisions. When you have invested deeply in a particular direction, changing course can feel like admitting you were wrong, like a personal failure rather than a strategic adjustment. But the strategist does not conflate the two. She understands that changing direction is often the most intelligent response to new information. It is not weakness. It is adaptation. Consider how this applies to the smaller, daily decisions that accumulate into the texture of your life. You have routines, habits, and default patterns that guide much of your behavior. Many of these patterns were established at a different time, under different circumstances, by a version of yourself who had different needs and priorities. Yet you continue them, often without examination, because they are familiar, because they require no decision, because changing them would mean confronting the discomfort of uncertainty. But these patterns are decisions too, just ones you have automated. And if they are no longer serving you, if they are draining your energy or pulling you away from what matters, then they deserve the same strategic attention you would give to a major life choice. You can ask, what is the probable outcome if I continue this pattern? What would I gain by changing it? What is the cost of experimentation? Often, the cost is lower than you imagine. The routines you cling to provide a sense of stability, but they can also create a kind of inertia that keeps you from discovering what might work better. By treating your habits as hypotheses, as provisional structures rather than fixed truths, you open space for improvement without needing to overhaul everything at once. This brings us to the question of how you manage errors, because errors are inevitable. No matter how carefully you think, how much you plan, how strategic your approach, you will make mistakes. You will misread situations, misjudge people, overlook important variables. The question is not whether this will happen. It is what you do when it does. Most people respond to mistakes with shame or denial. Shame tells you that the error reveals something fundamentally wrong with you, that you are not capable or intelligent enough to navigate complexity. Denial tells you that the error was not really an error, that the outcome was unavoidable, that you did everything correctly and were simply unlucky. Both responses prevent learning. Strategic thinking offers a third way. It treats errors as data. When something goes wrong, the strategist asks, "What did I misunderstand? What signal did I miss? What assumption turned out to be false?" She does this not to punish herself, but to update her mental models, to improve the quality of her thinking going forward. This requires a certain emotional discipline. It requires you to sit with the discomfort of being wrong without collapsing into self-recrimination or defensiveness. It requires you to separate your worth as a person from the quality of any single decision. But if you can cultivate this capacity, mistakes become less frightening. They become part of the process, information you needed that you could only obtain by taking action. There is also the matter of how you think about risk itself. Risk is not a monolithic thing. Different types of risk have different qualities, different potential consequences, different probabilities. The risk of embarrassment is not the same as the risk of financial ruin. The risk of wasted time is not the same as the risk of physical harm. Yet we often treat all risks as equivalent, as things to be avoided whenever possible. Strategic thinking distinguishes between risks worth taking and risks worth avoiding. It recognizes that some risks are essential for growth, for learning, for movement toward what you care about. If you eliminate all risk, you also eliminate possibility. You create a life that is safe but stagnant, comfortable but constrained. The question, then, is not how do I avoid risk? But which risks am I willing to take, and how do I manage them intelligently? This involves understanding your own risk tolerance, the level of uncertainty you can handle without becoming paralyzed. It also involves understanding the asymmetry of outcomes. Some bets, if they pay off, offer enormous upside relative to the downside if they fail. Others offer minimal upside with catastrophic downside. The strategic mind learns to distinguish between these, to seek out favorable asymmetries and avoid unfavorable ones. Imagine you are considering starting a side project, something that interests you but has no guarantee of success. The downside is the time and energy you invest, perhaps some minor financial cost. The upside is the possibility of discovering a new direction, building a skill, connecting with like-minded people, or even generating income. This is a favorable asymmetry. The potential gain is large relative to the potential loss. Even if the project fails, you will have learned something. Even if it goes nowhere, the experience itself may prove valuable in ways you cannot foresee. Contrast this with a decision to take on debt for a speculative investment with no clear path to return. The downside is significant financial strain, potential damage to your credit, stress that bleeds into other areas of life. The upside, while possibly large, is uncertain and contingent on factors beyond your control. This is an unfavorable asymmetry, the kind of risk that strategic thinking encourages you to avoid or manage very carefully. By learning to evaluate risk in this way, you begin to develop a sense for which uncertainties are worth embracing and which are worth sidestepping. You do not become reckless, but neither do you become timid. You move through life with a calibrated courage, willing to bet on yourself when the conditions are favorable, willing to walk away when they are not. And through all of this, there is a deeper shift taking place, one that goes beyond individual decisions to the way you hold your life as a whole. When you stop demanding certainty, when you accept that you are navigating probabilities and adapting as you go, you begin to experience a different kind of control. It is not the control of someone who has mapped out every step and knows exactly where they will end up. It is the control of someone who trusts their ability to respond, who knows that whatever arises, they can think it through and find a way forward. This is the quiet confidence that strategic thinking cultivates. It is not loud or performative. It does not announce itself. But it changes how you move through the world, how you make choices, how you recover from setbacks. It allows you to act without needing guarantees, to commit without needing to know the ending, to plan without rigidity. You begin to see your life not as a problem to be solved but as a landscape to be navigated, one where the terrain shifts and the map is always incomplete, but where your ability to observe, to think, and to adjust gives you everything you need to keep moving toward what matters. And that, more than any perfect plan, more than any risk-free path, is what allows you to live with purpose and presence, awake to the texture of each moment while still oriented toward a future you are shaping with every choice you make. Chapter 5: Building a Strategic Life. There is a difference between having a strategy and living strategically. The first is an event, a moment of clarity where you sit down and map out a plan, define your goals, establish your priorities. It feels significant when you do it. There is a sense of control, of having taken charge of your direction. But then life resumes its usual pace, and the plan you made becomes a document on your desk or a file on your computer, something you glance at occasionally with a vague sense of guilt because you know you are not following it as closely as you intended. Living strategically is something else entirely. It is not a plan you create once and then execute. It is a way of being, a continuous practice of attention and adjustment. It is the difference between having a map and knowing how to navigate. The map is useful, but it is static. It shows you the territory as it was when the map was drawn. Navigation is dynamic. It requires you to read the terrain in real time, to notice when conditions have shifted, to adjust your course not because the destination is changed but because the path to it must evolve with circumstance. This distinction matters because most people approach strategic thinking as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a capacity to be developed. They believe that if they can just formulate the right plan, the right set of goals, the right vision for their future, then everything else will fall into place. And so they invest enormous energy into the planning itself, into getting the details perfect, into anticipating every contingency. But when the plan encounters reality, when the unexpected inevitably occurs, they find themselves disoriented, unsure of how to proceed because the script they wrote for themselves no longer matches the situation they are in. The person who lives strategically does not have this problem. Not because their plans are better or more comprehensive, but because they understand that the plan is not the point. The plan is a tool for thinking, a structure that helps you clarify what matters and what you are moving toward. But the real work is not in making the plan. The real work is in cultivating the mental habits that allow you to stay clear and responsive as you move through a world that will never fully cooperate with your intentions. This is what this final chapter is about. Not a set of techniques or a system to implement, but an exploration of what it means to build a life where strategic thinking is woven into the fabric of how you operate. A life where you do not need to force yourself to plan because thinking strategically has become as natural as breathing, as automatic as the way you adjust your balance when walking on uneven ground. Consider what it feels like when you are living reactively. You wake up each day and respond to whatever is most urgent. Emails demand attention. Messages need replies. Problems arise and you address them. There is a certain comfort in this mode because you are always busy, always doing something, and busyness can feel like progress. But at the end of the week, the month, the year, you look back and wonder where the time went. You were moving constantly but not necessarily forward. You were active but not intentional. The days blurred together because you were responding to life rather than shaping it. Reactive living is exhausting in a particular way. It is not the exhaustion that comes from hard work towards something you care about. It is the exhaustion of constantly being pulled in directions you did not choose, of feeling like life is happening to you rather than through you. This exhaustion accumulates over time, creating a background sense of frustration and helplessness that colors everything else. You begin to feel trapped, not by any specific circumstance, but by the general sense that you have lost agency over your own experience. Strategic living offers a way out of this, but not through grand gestures or dramatic life changes. It begins with something quieter, something almost invisible from the outside. It begins with the decision to pause, to create small pockets of space where you step back from the immediate demands and ask yourself whether the direction you are moving is still the direction you want to be moving. This sounds simple, perhaps even obvious. But observe how rarely you actually do it. How often do you stop in the middle of a busy week and ask yourself whether the tasks consuming your time are connected to anything you actually care about? How often do you review not just your schedule but the assumptions underlying that schedule, the commitments you have made, the patterns you have fallen into? Most people go months, sometimes years, without this kind of reflection. They operate on autopilot, following routines established long ago under different circumstances, and they wonder why life feels stale or why they seem to be working so hard for outcomes that do not satisfy them. The strategic mind builds in moments of review. Not because there is a rule that says you must, but because these moments are how you maintain clarity. They are how you prevent drift, that slow, almost imperceptible movement away from what matters toward what is merely urgent or convenient. Drift is insidious because it does not announce itself. You do not wake up one day and realize you have drifted. It happens gradually, one small compromise at a time, one postponed intention after another, until you find yourself somewhere you did not mean to be, doing things that do not align with who you thought you were becoming. Regular review is the antidote to drift. It does not need to be elaborate or time-consuming. An hour at the end of each week, a morning at the start of each month, a quiet afternoon at the beginning of a new year. The specific timing matters less than the consistency. What you are doing in these moments is not judging yourself or tallying up successes and failures. You are simply checking in, asking yourself a few key questions. What has my attention been on? What have I been moving toward? Is this still where I want to go? What have I learned that changes how I should think about the path ahead? These questions sound straightforward, but answering them honestly requires a certain kind of courage. It requires you to confront the gap between what you say you care about and where your energy actually goes. It requires you to acknowledge when something is not working, when a direction you committed to with such certainty 6 months ago no longer feels right. This is uncomfortable because it means admitting that you were wrong, or at least that you have changed, and there is a part of you that wants to believe you are consistent, that your convictions are stable, that the person you were when you made those initial plans is still the person you are now. But you are not that person. You cannot be. Life changes you. Experience changes you. Every choice you make, every situation you navigate, every conversation you have, subtly reshapes how you see yourself and what you want. The strategic mind does not resist this. It welcomes it. It understands that growth is not about becoming more fixed in your identity but more fluid, more able to adapt while still maintaining a core sense of what you value. This is where many people misunderstand what it means to live strategically. They think it requires unwavering commitment to a fixed vision, that to be strategic is to be rigid, to choose a destination and march toward it regardless of what you encounter along the way. But this is not strategic thinking. This is stubbornness masquerading as discipline. True strategic living requires something more nuanced, a balance between knowing where you are headed and remaining open to what you discover on the journey. Imagine you are walking through a forest. You have a general direction you want to go, perhaps toward a distant mountain you can see on the horizon. You set out with purpose, moving steadily. But as you walk, you notice things. A path that looks more passable than the one you are on. A stream you did not expect that requires you to shift your route. A clearing that offers a better vantage point to reassess where you are. A strategic walker does not ignore these discoveries in service of the original plan. She incorporates them. She adjusts. The mountain is still there, the destination has not changed, but the path to it becomes clearer with each observation. This is how strategic living works. You have a sense of direction, but you remain attentive to feedback. You notice what is working and what is not. You update your understanding based on what you learn. You do not cling to plans that no longer serve you, but neither do you abandon direction at the first sign of difficulty. You develop a kind of internal compass, a sense of what matters that guides your choices even as the specific tactics and approaches evolve. This internal compass is what people often mean when they talk about clarity. Clarity is not about having a detailed vision of your future or knowing exactly what you will be doing 5 years from now. That kind of specificity is often a fantasy, a comforting story you tell yourself to manage the inherent uncertainty of existence. Real clarity is something different. It is knowing what you care about, what you are unwilling to compromise on, what gives your life weight and meaning. It is understanding your own values deeply enough that you can evaluate choices against them without needing an explicit rule for every situation. When you have this kind of clarity, decision-making becomes less agonizing. Not because the choices are easier, but because you have a stable reference point. You can ask yourself, does this move me closer to what I value or further away? Does this align with the kind of person I am trying to become, or does it pull me in a different direction? These questions do not always yield obvious answers, but they provide a framework that cuts through the noise, that helps you distinguish between what matters and what merely feels urgent in the moment. People who live strategically share this quality of clarity. If you observe them closely, you will notice that they seem less frantic than others, less reactive. This is not because their lives are simpler or less demanding. Often their lives are quite complex, full of responsibilities and competing priorities. But they have a way of moving through that complexity without becoming lost in it. They maintain a sense of center, an internal stillness that allows them to respond rather than react, to choose rather than be chosen by circumstance. This quality is not innate. It is cultivated. It emerges from the practice of regular reflection, from the habit of stepping back and assessing, from the willingness to adjust course when needed. It comes from treating your life as a system that requires maintenance rather than a machine that, once set up correctly, will run indefinitely without attention. Think about any complex system you interact with. Your body, for instance. You do not eat one perfect meal and then assume you are nourished for life. You do not exercise once and expect to maintain fitness forever. Your body is a living system that requires ongoing attention, regular input, continuous adjustment. When you are tired, you rest. When you are hungry, you eat. When you notice pain or stiffness, you modify your activity. This is obvious when it comes to physical health, yet many people fail to apply the same logic to their lives as a whole. Your life is a living system. The strategies that work for you now may not work next year. The priorities that feel right today may shift as circumstances change. The relationships, commitments, and patterns that serve you in one phase of life may become burdensome or irrelevant in another. If you treat your strategic plan as fixed, if you decide once and then never revisit, you will find yourself increasingly misaligned with your own experience, living according to outdated instructions, wondering why things feel off even when you were doing everything you thought you were supposed to do. The strategic life is built on the recognition that you are not implementing a static plan. You are tending a dynamic system. This means building in rhythms of reflection, creating structures that prompt you to check in with yourself, to assess whether the patterns you have established are still serving you. This might look like a weekly review where you consider what you learned, what surprised you, what you would adjust going forward. It might look like a monthly check-in where you ask whether your energy is being spent in alignment with your stated priorities. It might look like an annual retreat where you step back from daily demands and think about the larger arc of your life. The specific practices matter less than the underlying commitment to ongoing attention. You are not trying to optimize every moment or achieve perfect alignment. You are simply staying awake, maintaining a connection between your daily choices and your deeper intentions. Over time, this practice compounds. The small adjustments you make, the subtle course corrections, add up to a life that feels increasingly coherent, increasingly yours. But there is a challenge here that must be acknowledged. This kind of ongoing reflection requires something that modern life does not readily provide: space. Not just physical space, though that can help, but mental space. Time that is not filled with tasks or stimulation, time where you are not consuming content or responding to demands, time where you can simply think. This has become almost countercultural. We live in an age that equates busyness with importance, that treats constant productivity as a virtue, that offers endless distractions to fill any moment of potential boredom or silence. To live strategically, you must reclaim space. You must create boundaries around your attention, protect time for thinking, resist the pull of constant activity. This is not about becoming withdrawn or disconnected. It is about recognizing that strategic thinking requires resources, and the primary resource it requires is your own mental bandwidth. If you are perpetually exhausted, overstimulated, and scattered, you cannot think clearly. You cannot maintain perspective. You drift by default because you lack the capacity to do anything else. Creating space might mean saying no to things that do not serve you, even when those things are good or interesting. It might mean setting boundaries with people you care about, not because you do not value them but because you cannot give them your full presence if you are depleted. It might mean turning off notifications, limiting your exposure to news and social media, choosing carefully what you allow into your awareness. These choices can feel selfish at first, as if you are withdrawing from the world or shirking responsibilities. But they are not selfish. They are necessary. You cannot be strategic if you are constantly overwhelmed. You cannot navigate thoughtfully if you have no space to think. When you do create this space, when you build in time for reflection and review, you begin to notice patterns you could not see before. You start to understand what energizes you and what drains you, what kinds of challenges you handle well and where you consistently struggle, what brings you satisfaction and what merely looks good from the outside. This self-knowledge is invaluable. It allows you to structure your life in ways that work with your nature rather than against it. For instance, you might discover that you are someone who thinks best in the morning, that your first few hours after waking are when you are most clear and creative. Once you know this, you can protect that time, reserve it for work that requires real thought rather than filling it with meetings or administrative tasks. Or you might notice that you consistently overcommit, that you say yes to things in moments of enthusiasm and then regret them later when you are overwhelmed. Once you see this pattern, you can implement a practice of pausing before committing, of giving yourself permission to check with your future self before adding something new to your plate. These insights seem small, almost trivial. But they accumulate. Each adjustment you make based on what you learn about yourself and your patterns creates a slightly better fit between your life and who you actually are. Over time, the friction decreases. Things flow more naturally. You are not constantly fighting yourself or forcing yourself into shapes that do not suit you. This is not about becoming perfect or eliminating all struggle. It is about aligning your external life with your internal reality in a way that makes movement easier, progress more sustainable. There is also the question of how you hold success in a strategic life. Most people define success externally, through markers that are visible to others: promotions, income, achievements, status. There is nothing wrong with wanting these things or working toward them. But if your sense of success is entirely external, you place yourself at the mercy of circumstances you cannot fully control. You make your well-being dependent on outcomes that may or may not materialize, on recognition that may or may not come, on validation from others who may have their own agendas and limitations. The strategic mind defines success differently. It focuses on process rather than outcome, on whether you are moving in a direction that matters rather than whether you have arrived at a specific destination. It asks, am I learning? Am I growing? Am I making choices that reflect my values? Am I navigating challenges with intelligence and resilience? These questions are within your control in a way that external outcomes are not. You cannot always control whether you get the promotion or whether your project succeeds in the marketplace. But you can control whether you show up thoughtfully, whether you learn from setbacks, whether you adjust your approach based on feedback. This shift in how you define success is liberating. It removes you from the constant anxiety of comparison, the exhausting race to keep up with others who are on entirely different paths with entirely different resources and constraints. It allows you to measure yourself against your own trajectory, to celebrate progress that might be invisible to others but is deeply meaningful to you. It creates a kind of internal stability, a sense that you are okay regardless of external circumstances because you know you are living with intention and awareness. But this does not mean abandoning ambition or becoming complacent. The strategic mind is often quite ambitious, but the ambition is channeled differently. It is not about proving something to others or accumulating markers of status. It is about exploring the edges of your own capacity, about seeing what you can build or create or become when you are thinking clearly and moving with purpose. This kind of ambition is sustainable because it is intrinsically motivated. You are not chasing external validation. You are pursuing something because it genuinely interests you, because it calls to you, because you cannot imagine not exploring it. And when you operate from this place, when your actions are aligned with your own sense of what matters, something interesting happens. You become more effective. Not because you are trying harder or working longer hours, but because your energy is focused. You are not wasting effort on things that do not serve you. You are not constantly second-guessing yourself or seeking permission from others. You are clear on where you are going and why, and that clarity translates into movement that is efficient and purposeful. People notice this. They may not be able to articulate what is different about you, but they sense it. There is a quality of presence, a sense that you are not scattered or desperate, that you know yourself and what you are about. This draws opportunities to you, not because you are trying to impress anyone but because people are naturally attracted to those who seem centered and intentional. You become someone others want to work with, collaborate with, learn from. This is one of the paradoxes of strategic living. When you stop focusing so intensely on external success, when you shift your attention to the quality of your thinking and the integrity of your choices, external success often follows more naturally. Not always in the forms you expected, not according to the timeline you might have preferred, but in ways that feel more satisfying because they emerge from who you actually are rather than who you thought you should be. But let us return to the core practice, the one that makes all of this possible, the regular act of checking in with yourself, of reviewing where you are and where you are going. This is not something you do once and then forget. It is a rhythm you establish, a recurring practice that becomes part of how you operate. And within this practice, there are layers, different levels of review that serve different purposes. At the most immediate level, there is daily reflection. This might be a few minutes at the end of each day where you simply note what happened, what you learned, what you want to carry forward or let go of. You are not trying to solve anything in these moments. You are simply processing, creating a small space between experience and sleep where you can metabolize the day rather than just moving immediately to the next thing. At a weekly level, the reflection can go deeper. Here you might look at the patterns of the week. Where did your time actually go? What received your attention? What kept getting postponed? Were there moments where you felt aligned and energized, and moments where you felt drained or off track? What do those patterns tell you about what might need adjusting? Monthly, you can zoom out further. You are looking at the arc of your progress on longer-term projects and commitments. You are asking whether the direction you are moving still feels right, whether your priorities are still serving you, whether there are relationships or obligations that need attention or renegotiation. You are also celebrating progress, acknowledging what you have accomplished or learned, marking growth that might otherwise go unnoticed in the daily press of activity. And then annually, or perhaps twice a year, you step back even further. You look at the larger shape of your life. You ask the big questions: am I becoming who I want to become? Are the major structures of my life, my work, my relationships, my environment, supporting that becoming? What needs to change at a fundamental level? Where have I been playing small or settling for less than what is possible? These different levels of review work together. The daily practice keeps you grounded and aware. The weekly practice helps you make small course corrections before drift becomes significant. The monthly practice ensures that your longer-term projects stay aligned with your intentions. The annual practice gives you perspective on the overall trajectory, helps you make the bigger adjustments that cannot be seen in the day-to-day. But here is what makes this work: you must approach these reviews with honesty and without judgment. If you use them to beat yourself up, to catalog all the ways you fell short or failed to live up to your own expectations, they become punishing rather than illuminating. The point is not to judge yourself but to learn, to gather information about how you operate, what works for you, where you consistently struggle. When you notice that you have drifted, that you spent the last month on things that do not matter to you, the response is not shame. It is curiosity. What pulled you off track? What made those distractions appealing? What were you avoiding? What need were you trying to meet? Often there is useful information in your drift, clues about what is missing from your life, what you are hungry for that you have not been feeding. Similarly, when you notice that something is working, that a particular practice or structure is serving you well, the response is to understand why. What about this approach aligns with your nature? How can you do more of it? How can you structure other parts of your life to have this same quality? Over time, this practice of reflective review builds something that is difficult to describe but profound in its effect: a sense of continuity. You begin to experience your life not as a series of disconnected days but as a coherent narrative, a story that is unfolding with you as both author and protagonist. You see how choices made months ago led to opportunities today. You understand how a difficult period you navigated shaped the person you are now. You recognize patterns in your own development, cycles of expansion and consolidation, challenge and integration. This continuity creates meaning. It helps you understand that nothing is wasted, that even the detours and mistakes contribute to the overall arc. It allows you to trust the process, to have faith that if you keep thinking clearly and adjusting thoughtfully, you will continue to move toward what matters even when the path is not straight, even when progress is invisible for long stretches. And this brings us to the final piece, the quality that characterizes those who live strategically, a particular kind of calm. Not the calm of someone who has no challenges or who has everything figured out. That does not exist. But the calm of someone who knows they can handle whatever arises, who trusts their ability to think through complexity, who has learned through experience that they can adapt and respond and keep moving forward. This calm comes from repetition, from having navigated uncertainty enough times that it is no longer terrifying. It comes from having made mistakes and survived them, from having adjusted course and discovered that the world did not end. It comes from the accumulated evidence that you are capable, that you can think strategically even under pressure, that you have resources within yourself that you can draw on when needed. This is the gift of building a strategic life. Not a perfect life, not a life free from difficulty or doubt, but a life where you are present, where you are making conscious choices, where you are shaping your experience rather than being passively shaped by it. A life where you wake up each day with a sense of direction, even if the specific path is unclear. A life where you can look back with satisfaction and forward with curiosity, knowing that you are the one holding the compass, the one steering through the complexity. And so we return to where we began, to the fundamental truth that strategic thinking reveals: your life is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in creating, moment by moment, choice by choice. The quality of that creation depends not on how smart you are or how talented or how fortunate, but on how clearly you can think, how willing you are to pay attention, how committed you are to the ongoing work of alignment and adjustment. This is not about perfection. It is about presence. It is about showing up to your own life with awareness and intention, with the recognition that you have agency, that your choices matter, that the way you think shapes the world you inhabit. It is about understanding that success, real success, is not measured in achievements or accolades but in the quality of your engagement with your own existence. When you live strategically, you are not following a script written by someone else. You are not chasing a destination defined by culture or family or peers. You are authoring your own experience, guided by what you know to be true about yourself, what you have learned about what works, what you value enough to organize your life around. This requires courage because it means taking responsibility, accepting that you cannot blame circumstances or other people for where you end up. But it also offers freedom, the freedom that comes from knowing you are the one deciding, the one choosing, the one building. Success, then, is not the result of random efforts scattered in whatever direction seems promising at the moment. It is not the product of luck or happenstance or being in the right place at the right time. Success is what emerges when you think clearly about what matters, when you make conscious choices aligned with that clarity, when you pay attention to feedback and adjust your approach accordingly. It is the natural outcome of strategic thinking applied consistently over time. This is the path forward. Not a single decision that changes everything, but a practice that compounds, a way of engaging with your life that makes each day more intentional, each choice more aligned, each year more yours. You do not need a perfect plan. You need a commitment to thinking well, to staying awake, to tending the living system of your life with care and attention. Do that, and the rest follows. Not perfectly, not according to any predetermined design, but in ways that feel true, that feel like movement towards something that matters, that feel like a life worth living. This is what it means to build a strategic life. Not to have all the answers, but to keep asking the right questions. Not to eliminate uncertainty, but to navigate it with clarity and calm. Not to control everything, but to shape what you can, to influence the direction of your own becoming. And in doing so, to discover that you were always more capable, more resilient, more creative than you knew. That the life you want is not waiting for you somewhere in the future. It is being built right now, in this moment, with the choices you are making and the attention you are bringing. All that is required is that you begin. That you commit to thinking clearly. That you trust that conscious, strategic movement, repeated over time, will take you somewhere worth going. The question is not whether you can live strategically. You can. The question is whether you will. And perhaps this is where the conversation must become more intimate, more personal, because up until now we have been speaking about principles and frameworks, about how strategic thinking operates in the abstract. But you are not an abstraction. You are a specific person reading these words in a specific moment of your life, and that moment carries its own weight, its own history, its own particular challenges and possibilities. So let us speak directly to that. Let us acknowledge what you already know but may not have fully articulated. You are tired of living reactively. You are tired of feeling like time is slipping away while you remain busy but not purposeful. You are tired of the gap between who you think you should be and who you actually are, between what you say matters to you and where your energy actually goes. This tiredness is not weakness. It is a signal. It is your deeper self trying to get your attention, trying to tell you that something needs to change. But here is what makes this moment dangerous: the temptation to respond to this exhaustion with more effort, more discipline, more forcing. You look at your life and see all the ways it falls short of what you imagined, and the instinct is to crack down, to push harder, to implement systems and routines that will finally get you where you think you need to be. This rarely works. Not because you lack the capacity for discipline, but because the problem is not effort. The problem is clarity. The problem is that you have been moving without truly understanding where you are trying to go or why. Strategic living does not ask you to do more. It asks you to think more carefully about what you are already doing. It asks you to pause long enough to notice whether your daily actions are connected to anything that genuinely matters to you, or whether you are simply performing a version of life that you think you are supposed to be living. This pause, this moment of honest assessment, is where everything begins. You might resist this. There are good reasons to resist it. Honest self-assessment can be uncomfortable. It requires you to acknowledge things you have been avoiding, to see patterns you would rather not see, to admit that choices you made with confidence have not led where you hoped they would. There is a kind of safety in staying busy, in never stopping long enough to really look at your life, because as long as you are moving you can tell yourself you are making progress. But motion is not the same as progress. You can be very busy going nowhere that matters. What would it look like to stop? Not forever, not even for long, but just for an afternoon, a weekend, a single undistracted hour where you let yourself think without agenda, without trying to fix or optimize or plan, just observing your own experience with curiosity. What would you notice if you gave yourself permission to simply look? You might notice that many of your commitments feel like obligations rather than choices, that you are carrying responsibilities you never consciously agreed to, that you are living according to expectations you absorbed so long ago you have forgotten they came from outside you. You might notice that you are afraid, not of failure exactly, but of the vulnerability that comes with admitting what you actually want, with letting yourself be seen in your uncertainty and your longing. You might notice that you have been so focused on arriving somewhere that you have forgotten to pay attention to the journey, that you have been sacrificing present aliveness for a future that keeps receding no matter how hard you chase it. These are not comfortable things to notice. But they are also not enemies. They are information. They are the raw material you need to begin building something more aligned, more true, more yours. The strategic mind does not turn away from uncomfortable truths. It leans into them, not with judgment but with curiosity, asking, what is this telling me? What does this reveal about what needs to change? And here is what often emerges when you give yourself space to really look: the realization that you do not need to overhaul your entire life in one dramatic gesture. You do not need to quit your job, move to another city, end relationships, start from scratch. What you need is much smaller and much harder. You need to start making different choices in the small moments that make up your days. The strategic life is not built through grand transformations. It is built through the accumulation of small, conscious choices that compound over time. It is built by noticing when you are about to say yes to something that will drain you and pausing long enough to ask whether that yes serves anything you care about. It is built by recognizing when you are avoiding a difficult conversation and choosing to have it anyway, not because conflict is comfortable but because the alternative, the slow erosion of connection through accumulated resentment, is worse. It is built by setting aside time to think, even when, especially when, you feel like you cannot afford it. These moments are not dramatic. They will not feel significant when they happen. But they are the building blocks of a different kind of life, a life where you are present, where you are choosing, where you are shaping your experience rather than being shaped by default patterns and unconscious reactions. And the beautiful thing about small conscious choices is that they create momentum. Each time you choose deliberately, you strengthen the part of you that is capable of choosing. You make it slightly easier to choose consciously the next time. This is how people change, not through heroic acts of willpower but through the patient accumulation of better choices, through the slow rewiring of habit and attention. You cannot think your way into a new way of living. You must live your way into a new way of thinking. And that living happens one moment at a time, one choice at a time, one small act of consciousness at a time. But let us also be honest about what this requires. It requires something that our culture does not particularly value: the willingness to be ordinary. We live in a time that celebrates the exceptional, that tells stories of overnight success and radical transformation, that makes it seem like meaningful change happens suddenly and completely or not at all. This is a lie, and it is a lie that keeps people stuck because they are waiting for the dramatic moment, the perfect conditions, the moment when they will finally feel ready to begin. You will never feel ready. There will never be perfect conditions. The dramatic moment you are waiting for is not coming. What is available to you right now, in this present moment with all its limitations and constraints, is the choice to think a little more clearly about what you are doing and why. That is all. That is everything. The strategic life is not glamorous. It does not make for compelling social media posts. It is mostly invisible from the outside. It is the quiet discipline of regular reflection, the unglamorous work of reviewing your week and adjusting your approach, the small courage of saying no to things that do not serve you even when saying yes would be easier. It is the patience to trust that small improvements, repeated consistently, will compound into something significant over time. This patience is difficult because we want results now. We want to see progress immediately. We want the satisfaction of dramatic before and after comparisons. But meaningful change operates on a different timescale. It unfolds gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look back and realize that your life has shifted, that you are operating differently, that choices that once felt difficult have become natural, that clarity that once required effort has become your default state. This is what awaits you if you commit to this path. Not perfection, not the elimination of all struggle, not a life free from difficulty or doubt. But something more valuable, a sense of authorship over your own experience, a feeling of coherence between what you value and how you live, a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can think through whatever arises and find a way forward. You do not need to believe that this is possible for you. Belief can come later. Right now, all you need is a willingness to experiment, to try thinking more strategically about one area of your life and see what happens. Pick something small, something that matters but is not overwhelming. Maybe it is how you structure your mornings, or how you approach a recurring challenge at work, or how you have a difficult conversation you have been avoiding. Apply the principles we have been exploring. Clarify what you actually want, consider the probable outcomes of different approaches, choose consciously, pay attention to feedback, adjust as needed. Do this for a month. Not perfectly, not with unwavering consistency, just with enough regularity that you can gather data about what happens when you bring this quality of attention to an area of your life. Notice what changes. Notice what becomes easier. Notice what you learn about yourself and how you operate. And then, if it serves you, expand. Take what you learned and apply it to another area. Slowly, incrementally, build a life where strategic thinking is not something you do but something you are. This is the invitation. Not to become someone else, not to transform yourself into some idealized version of who you think you should be, but to become more fully yourself, to bring consciousness to choices that have been unconscious, to align your daily actions with what you genuinely care about. The path is simple, though not easy. It requires attention, honesty, and the willingness to keep adjusting even when you would rather settle into comfortable patterns. But the alternative is to continue as you have been, to keep hoping that somehow, through some mechanism you cannot quite identify, things will get better on their own. They will not. Not because you are inadequate, but because the kind of life worth living, the kind of life that feels coherent and meaningful and yours, does not happen by accident. It happens through the patient application of conscious choice, through strategic thinking embodied in daily action, through the accumulation of small moments where you chose presence over autopilot, intention over default, clarity over confusion. This is what success actually looks like. Not the highlight reel, not the polished narrative, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you are living deliberately, that you are paying attention, that you are shaping your experience through the quality of your thinking and the consciousness of your choices. It is waking up each day with a sense of direction, even when the specific path is unclear. It is navigating challenges with resilience because you trust your ability to think through complexity. It is looking back with minimal regret because you know you were present, you were choosing, you were doing your best with what you knew at the time. And so we arrive at the end, which is really just a beginning. You close this book and return to your life, to the same circumstances and challenges that were there before you started reading. Nothing external has changed. But something internal has shifted. You have been given a framework, a way of thinking about your life that emphasizes consciousness over effort, strategic clarity over brute force, presence over perpetual striving towards some distant future. What you do with this framework is up to you. You can return to your old patterns, and no one will blame you. The pull of habit is strong, and the world does not make strategic living easy. Or you can begin, right now, with the next choice you make, to bring a little more awareness, a little more intention, a little more strategic thinking to how you navigate your life. You can ask yourself, does this serve what I care about? Is this moving me toward clarity or away from it? Am I choosing consciously or reacting unconsciously? These questions change things. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, incrementally, until one day you realize that your life feels different, that you feel different, that you have become someone who lives strategically not because you are forcing yourself to but because it has become the most natural way to be. This is the promise. This is the possibility. Not certainty, not a guarantee, but a path forward that honors your intelligence, your agency, your capacity to shape your experience through the quality of your thinking. All that remains is the choice to begin, and to keep beginning, moment after moment, day after day, until strategic living is no longer something you do but simply who you are.